I came back from work and found all my stuff soaking in the rain on his front lawn. 3 weeks on his couch apparently made me a freeloader, but what he did next destroyed my reputation and turned our entire friend group against me. I'm standing there in my work uniform, staring at my laptop bag, getting completely drenched, and I can't even process what I'm seeing. My clothes are scattered across his grass, my makeup bag split open with everything spilling out, and my favorite boots are sitting in a puddle by his mailbox. I run up to his front door and start pounding on it, but he won't even answer. I can see him through the window just sitting on his couch, the same couch I'd been sleeping on for weeks, and he's completely ignoring me. I'm screaming, "Tyler, what the hell is wrong with you?" and banging on the glass, but he just turns up his TV louder. His neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, comes out and starts recording me with her phone, which makes everything 10 times worse because now I look like some crazy person having a breakdown in front of his house. I told her, "This is a private matter between me and my boyfriend," but she just kept filming and said, "He told us you don't live here anymore." That's when I realized he'd been talking to people about our situation behind my back, probably painting me as some kind of psycho when I was just going through the hardest time of my life. I needed that couch. I needed somewhere safe to stay, and he knew that. We have history together, 2 years of dating, all those promises about always being there for each other, and this is how he treats me when I'm vulnerable. Let me explain how this whole mess started, because I was just trying to survive, and everyone's acting like I committed some terrible crime. My name's Rachel, I'm 31 years old, and I work at a dental office as a hygienist. 3 weeks ago, my roommate Brittany decided to move in with her boyfriend without giving me any real notice, just said, "I'm out by the end of the month," like it was no big deal. I couldn't afford the rent on my own, obviously, because who can afford a 2-bedroom apartment in this economy by themselves? The only logical option was Tyler, because we dated for 2 years and ended things on good terms about 6 months ago. I texted him saying, "Hey, I know this is random, but I'm in a really tough spot with housing right now and was wondering if I could crash on your couch for just a few days while I figure things out." He didn't respond for 3 hours, which should have been my first clue. When he finally wrote back, he said, "I guess for a couple nights, but I'm pretty busy with work stuff right now." That Friday, I showed up at his place with 2 suitcases and my laptop bag. He seemed uncomfortable when he opened the door, but I figured he just wasn't used to having someone around anymore. I said, "Thank you so much for this, Tyler. You're literally saving my life right now," and gave him a hug, but he kind of just stood there stiffly. He showed me where I could put my stuff and got me some sheets and a pillow for the couch. The first couple days went fine. I was careful to clean up after myself, didn't make much noise, tried to stay out of his way when he was home. But then I started noticing how much the apartment had changed since we were together. He'd gotten new furniture, painted the bedroom, completely rearranged everything. It made me realize how much he'd moved on while I was still struggling to get my life together. On Sunday, I made breakfast for both of us as a thank you gesture. Just scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, but when he came out of his room, he seemed annoyed about it. He said, "I don't usually eat breakfast," and I said, "I was just trying to be nice since you're helping me out." He ate it, but the whole time he was checking his phone and acting like he wanted to be anywhere else. By the end of the first week, I could tell his patience was wearing thin, even though I was being perfectly reasonable about everything. He came home from work on Thursday and found me video chatting with my friend Sarah on his couch and got weird about it. I told her, "Yeah, I'm staying at Tyler's place for a bit while I look for apartments." And after I hung up, he said, "I'd prefer if you didn't tell people you're living here." I said, "I'm not living here, I'm just crashing here temporarily." But he said, "It's the same thing to other people." I couldn't understand why he was being so paranoid about it. That weekend, things got even more tense because I had to do laundry. I asked permission first, said, "Is it okay if I throw a load in while you're at the gym?" And he said fine, but when he came back, he seemed irritated that my clothes were in his dryer. The second week is when everything started falling apart. I had to stay late at work on Tuesday and didn't get back until almost 9 p.m. I was exhausted and hungry, so I opened his refrigerator to see if there was anything I could make for dinner, and he came out of his room and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I was just looking for something to eat. I haven't had dinner yet." And he said, "I didn't really plan on sharing groceries." I couldn't believe he was being so petty about food. I said, "Tyler, I can pay you back for whatever I eat. It's not a big deal." But he said, "It's not about the money, it's about boundaries." Boundaries. Like I was some stranger who wandered in off the street instead of someone he dated for 2 years. I told him, "I'm not trying to cross any boundaries. I'm just hungry and tired and trying to survive right now." And he said, "Maybe you should think about getting your own place sooner rather than later." I ended up ordering takeout that night and eating it alone on his couch while he stayed in his room. I texted my friend Sarah and told her what happened, and she said, "That's really cold of him. You guys dated for 2 years and he can't share some food." Sarah suggested I talk to our mutual friend Mike about maybe staying at his place for a few days to give Tyler some space. But when I called Mike, he said, "Tyler actually already called me about this and asked me not to get involved." I was shocked. Tyler had been calling our friends behind my back and basically poisoning them against me before I even had a chance to ask for help. I confronted him about it that night and said, "Why would you call Mike and tell him not to help me?" And he said, "I didn't tell him not to help you. I just said this was between us." But that's not what Mike told me. Mike specifically said Tyler asked him not to get involved. The third week is when everything really went off the rails. I came home from work on Monday, and Tyler was sitting at his kitchen table with his laptop. He said, "We need to talk," in this very serious tone that made my stomach drop. He said, "Rachel, this isn't working out and I need you to find somewhere else to stay by this weekend." I said, "This weekend?" "Tyler, it's Monday. That's like 4 days." And he said, "I know, but I've been thinking about this for a while." I started getting emotional because 4 days is not enough time to find an apartment. I said, "Tyler, please, I just need a little more time. I'm actively looking every day." And he said, "I understand, but I can't do this anymore." I asked him what specifically I had done wrong, and he said, "It's not about doing anything wrong. It's about boundaries and personal space." I started crying at that point because I felt so helpless and abandoned. I said, "Tyler, I don't have anywhere else to go right now. Can't you please just give me 2 more weeks?" And he said, "I'm sorry, Rachel, but my mind is made up." I said, "What am I supposed to do, sleep in my car?" And he said, "I'm sure you'll figure something out." I spent the next 2 days frantically calling everyone I could think of, trying to find somewhere to stay. My coworker Lisa said I could sleep on her couch for a couple nights, but she has roommates who weren't comfortable with a long-term guest. My friend Emma was out of town for work. Nobody understood my situation. Friday came and I still hadn't found anywhere to go. I was supposed to be out by Sunday, but I had nowhere to move my stuff. I decided to try one more time to reason with Tyler. I waited until he got home from work and said, "Tyler, I know you want me out and I respect that, but I literally have nowhere to go yet." He said, "That's not my problem anymore, Rachel." And I said, "How can you say that's not your problem? I'm a human being." He said, "I'm not throwing you away. I'm asking you to find your own place to live like an adult." That's when I really lost it. I said, "Like an adult?" "Tyler, I'm being an adult. I'm working full-time and trying to solve my housing crisis and asking for basic human compassion from someone who used to care about me." He said, "This isn't about compassion, Rachel. This is about boundaries." Saturday morning, Tyler said, "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" And I said, "Tyler, I'm trying my best, but I need more time." He said, "Rachel, we agreed on this weekend." And I said, "You decided on this weekend. I never agreed to anything." Sunday came and I still had nowhere to go. Tyler said, "Well, you can't stay here tonight." And I said, "So you're literally going to put me on the street?" He thought about it for a long time and finally said, "Okay, 3 more days, but that's absolutely it." I was so relieved. I said, "Thank you, Tyler. I promise I'll be out by Wednesday." And he said, "You better be, because I'm not having this conversation again." Monday and Tuesday, I saw 2 apartments that could work, but both landlords wanted me to fill out applications and wait for approval. I explained this to Tyler Tuesday night, and he said, That's not my problem, Rachel. You knew Wednesday was the deadline. I said, Tyler, please, if I get approved for one of these places, I'll be out by next weekend at the latest. And he said, we had an agreement about Wednesday. Wednesday morning, I woke up and Tyler was already gone for work. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter that said, Rachel, please have your things packed and be gone by the time I get home at 6. Thank you. I called in sick to work because I was having a complete breakdown. I spent the day crying and packing my stuff and trying to figure out what I was going to do. My friend Sarah called me back and said her cousin Mark had a basement apartment, but then called back an hour later saying his wife was uncomfortable with someone they don't know staying there. So there I was again, completely screwed with nowhere to go. My coworker Amy said I could stay at her place one night, but she made it clear it was just temporary. Thursday night, Amy said her sister was visiting this weekend, so I'd need to find somewhere else by Friday. One day notice again. I was getting ready to leave when I decided to call Tyler one more time. I said, Tyler, I know you said Wednesday was final, but I'm in a really bad situation right now, and I was wondering if I could just stay on your couch for maybe 3 more days while I wait to hear back from these apartments. He said, Rachel, we already went through this. You can't stay here anymore. I said, Tyler, please. I'm literally about to be homeless, and you have that whole apartment to yourself. And he said, Rachel, this is exactly why I needed you out, because you can't accept boundaries. He hung up on me. That's when I made what was probably a really bad decision. I was so emotionally exhausted and scared that I decided to go to happy hour at Murphy's, where Tyler and I used to hang out. I ran into our mutual friend Jake and told him everything. Jake bought me several drinks and said, Tyler's being a real asshole about this whole thing. Jake said, you know what? Maybe you should go tell Tyler how that makes you feel. I was pretty drunk at that point, and Jake's suggestion seemed reasonable. I took an Uber to Tyler's place and knocked on his door. When he answered, I said, Tyler, I need to talk to you about this situation. And he said, Rachel, are you drunk? I said, I had a few drinks, but that's not the point. And he said, you can't be here right now. I said, Tyler, please just listen to me for 5 minutes. But I was already walking past him into his apartment. I sat down on his couch and said, Tyler, we need to figure this out like adults. He said, Rachel, you're drunk and you're trespassing and you need to leave immediately. But I said, I'm not trespassing, Tyler. We have history together. We went back and forth for probably 20 minutes. I was crying and he was getting more frustrated. Finally, I said, Tyler, I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired and scared, and I just need somewhere safe to sleep tonight. He stood there looking at me for a long time and finally said, Okay, Rachel, you can sleep it off on the couch tonight, but you have to be gone before I leave for work tomorrow morning. I woke up the next morning with the worst hangover. Tyler was already gone, and there was another note saying, Please lock the door behind you when you leave. I felt terrible about the night before, but I also felt like he could have been more understanding about my situation. I packed up my stuff and left like he asked. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel room that cost me $80 I couldn't really afford. Sunday, I drove past his building because there was a coffee shop nearby, and I realized I'd left some work stuff in his apartment. I knocked on his door and said, Tyler, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I left some work stuff and I need it for tomorrow. He looked annoyed but let me in to get my things. Monday, I went to work and tried to act normal, but I was completely distracted. That's when I made another, probably stupid decision. After work, I drove to his place and knocked on his door. When he answered, I said, Tyler, I know you said not to come back, but I wanted to talk to you when I wasn't drunk and emotional. He said, Rachel, what part of don't come back did you not understand? I said, Tyler, please just hear me out for 2 minutes. He looked really tired but said, 2 minutes, Rachel. That's it. I said, I applied for 3 apartments last week and I should hear back by Wednesday. I just need somewhere to sleep for 2 nights. He said, Rachel, you said that exact same thing 3 weeks ago. And I said, this is different, Tyler. I have actual applications pending. He said, it doesn't matter, Rachel. The answer is no. And I said, Tyler, please. I'm literally going to have to sleep in my car tonight. He said, that's not my problem, Rachel. And I said, Tyler, how can you say that's not your problem? I'm a human being and we have history together. I started crying because I felt so hopeless. I said, Tyler, I don't understand how you can be so cruel to someone you used to love. And he said, Rachel, I'm not being cruel. I'm being realistic about what I can and can't handle. The conversation was going nowhere, so I just left. That night, I slept in my car in a Walmart parking lot, and it was miserable. Around 3 a.m., I decided this was ridiculous and drove back to his apartment complex. I sat there for a while and finally texted him, Tyler, I'm sitting in my car in your parking lot because I have nowhere else to go. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Tyler, and he sounded really angry. He said, Rachel, what the hell are you doing in my parking lot at 3 a.m.? I said, Tyler, I told you, I have nowhere else to go. And he said, Rachel, you cannot sleep in your car in my parking lot. That's completely inappropriate. I said, Tyler, I'm not bothering anyone. And he said, Rachel, if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. The police. He was threatening to call the police on me, like I was some dangerous person, instead of someone he used to date who was going through a crisis. I said, Tyler, I'm not stalking you. I'm homeless and desperate. And he said, Rachel, I don't care what your justification is. You cannot be in my parking lot in the middle of the night. I drove away because I didn't want him to actually call the police. The next morning, I got an email from one of the apartments saying they'd chosen another applicant. Wednesday, I got another rejection. At that point, I was starting to panic because my money was running out and I couldn't keep sleeping in my car. Thursday morning, I was so tired and miserable that I called in sick again. I was sitting in my car outside a McDonald's when my coworker Lisa called to check on me. She said, Rachel, maybe if you showed up with all your stuff and just refused to leave, he'd have to let you stay. I knew Lisa meant well, but that seemed like terrible advice. But I was also so desperate that part of me thought maybe she was right. That afternoon, I packed everything I owned into my car and drove to Tyler's apartment. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, trying to decide if this was a good idea. Finally, I knocked on his door, and when he answered, I said, Tyler, I know you're going to be angry, but I need to talk to you. He saw my car packed with all my stuff and said, Rachel, what are you doing? I said, Tyler, I can't do this anymore. I'm sick and exhausted, and I can't sleep in my car another night. He said, Rachel, we've already discussed this, and I said, Tyler, please just look at me and tell me you think this is okay. I was crying and probably looked terrible. I said, Tyler, can I please just come inside and we can figure this out together? And he said, Rachel, no. But I was already walking past him. I sat down on his couch and said, Tyler, I'm not leaving until we solve this problem together. He said, Rachel, if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. And I said, Tyler, go ahead and call them. Maybe they can help me find somewhere to stay since you won't. He actually picked up his phone and started dialing, and I said, Tyler, really? You're really going to call the police on someone who's homeless and desperate? He put the phone down and said, Rachel, fine. You can stay tonight, but tomorrow morning you need to be gone and you cannot come back here ever again. I said, Tyler, thank you. I promise this is the last time. And he said, it better be Rachel, because I mean it about calling the police. Friday morning, Tyler left for work without saying goodbye. I got up and started packing my stuff, but I was moving slowly because I still didn't have anywhere to go. I was sitting on Tyler's couch trying to figure out what to do when I realized maybe I should just stay put until he got home and try to reason with him one more time. When Tyler got home from work, he saw me still there and said, Rachel, what are you still doing here? I said, Tyler, I was hoping we could talk about extending the deadline just a few more days. And he said, Rachel, we already talked about this. You need to be gone today. He went into his bedroom and came back with his phone and said, Rachel, if you're not gone in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police. I realized he actually meant it this time, so I started frantically packing my things. When I finished packing, I said, Tyler, I can't believe you're doing this to me. And he said, Rachel, you're doing this to yourself. I left his apartment and sat in my car, trying to figure out what to do. I remembered that Tyler usually went out Friday nights, so I waited until I saw him leave around 8 p.m. Then I went back to his apartment and let myself in with the spare key I knew he kept under his doormat. I just planned to sleep on the couch and leave early in the morning. But I was so emotionally exhausted that I fell into a really deep sleep. I didn't wake up until late Saturday morning, and when I opened my eyes, Tyler was standing over me, looking absolutely furious. He said, "Rachel, what the hell are you doing in my apartment?" I said, "Tyler, I'm sorry. I was just so tired and I didn't have anywhere else to go." He said, "Rachel, you broke into my apartment." And I said, "Tyler, I didn't break in. I used the spare key." And he said, "Rachel, that's still breaking and entering." He was really angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He started throwing my stuff into bags and said, "Rachel, if you're not out of here in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police and pressing charges." I gathered everything as quickly as I could, and Tyler followed me to the door. When I got to my car, he said, "Rachel, if I see you on this property again, I'm calling the police immediately." I gave him the spare key and said, "Tyler, I'm sorry it came to this." And he said, "Rachel, I'm not sorry. I should have called the police weeks ago." I spent the weekend sleeping in my car again and finally decided to move back in with my parents. It wasn't what I wanted, but it seemed like my only option. Friday, I was packing up my car to drive to my parents' house when I decided to try one more time to apologize to Tyler. When he pulled up and saw me, he looked really annoyed. He got out of his car and said, "Rachel, what are you doing here?" I said, "Tyler, I'm leaving town tonight, but I wanted to apologize before I go." He said, "5 minutes, Rachel. That's it." I said, "Tyler, I know I made some bad decisions, but I want you to understand that I was in genuine crisis." And he said, "Rachel, being in crisis doesn't excuse breaking into my apartment." I said, "Tyler, I know it was wrong, but I was homeless and scared." And he said, "Rachel, that's not my problem to solve." We talked for a few more minutes, but it was clear we were never going to agree. I said, "Tyler, fine. I'm moving back in with my parents tonight and you'll never have to deal with me again." And he said, "Rachel, I think that's the right choice." I said, "Tyler, I hope someday you realize how cruel you were." And he said, "Rachel, I hope someday you realize how inappropriate your behavior was." 6 months later, I was doing much better, but I still couldn't understand how Tyler could have been so heartless about my situation. I really believed I was just trying to survive the hardest time of my adult life, and the person I trusted most basically threw me away like garbage. I still don't understand how someone can be so cruel when all I needed was basic human compassion during a crisis. Subscribe if you think asking for help during a crisis shouldn't make you the villain. Hit like if you've ever been abandoned by someone who promised to always be there for you. What would you have done if your ex refused to help when you were literally about to be homeless? Let me know in the comments.